Well, thank you so much, Michael, for joining me today. Really, really excited to talk about a lot of interesting things and the impact investing space around, food and technology and just overall the emergence of sort of the sector of impact investing and perhaps where we are now, maybe where you see that going. But let's start just a little bit about, your journey into the sector of impact investing and maybe how you got there. Let's start there and then we'll get into some goodness.
It started at Morgan Stanley right out of college. I got into wealth management. I wanted to really focus on a particular niche and not just be a generalist, and landed on the idea of serving the LGBT community. I had grown up in the West Village of New York during the 80s and 90s. And, I was just very connected to that community from that experience. And at the time, the marriage laws in the US were not on an even playing field. And so there were disadvantages to same-sex couples on a number of levels. And so I thought that would be kind of a great opportunity to serve a community that was near and dear to my heart and also do well in the process. And it was in working with some of my clients that the questions started to come up around, how do we avoid investing in companies that basically don't like us,
Right.
and that was, the first, time I had sort of thought about socially responsible investing, or even had to inquire as to whether that was a thing and could we do it. And that was basically the spark that led me down the rabbit hole of sustainable investing and impact investing. My heart, told me that at some point the laws would change and I would need to effectively shut down, the niche that I had been operating. And so sustainability and impact became this exciting thing that I could start looking towards as the next theme once the laws start to shift, which they did in 2014. And so I had a couple of years to sort of get, my pencil sharpened and to learn, as much as I could to, really start doing that well. And, I've been running with it ever since.
So over that time period, you've seen obviously the sector sort of grow into every different, I think, business sector at this point has been touched in some way of whether it's social responsibility, whether it's impact, socially conscious. I mean, there's all these different terms, right? But, essentially the idea that, maybe business can be done a little better and go even further. The allocation of capital can be done better in investing in certain companies. What, I guess, over, decades now, like how have you seen the industry change, and have you seen it change for the better in that, we see greenwashing and sort of from a brand corporate side. Is that still a factor that you see maybe investors themselves, right? Allocators of capital getting into industry because it's a bit trending. And does that rub you the wrong way a little bit? Do you see a lot of that?
Well, certainly in the last 10 plus years, impact investing has gone from being something that people were like, what is that? Like, what is that charity? There was sort of a confusing thing that most people didn't quite understand, certainly didn't think was viable. So I was definitely wearing sort of the dunce cap on Wall Street for a while, doing this sort of fringe thing. And now, fast forward to where we are today, and it's on the lips of just about every investor for the most part, or they're aware of it. They understand it's a thing. They may not buy into it, but it's now, sort of a broad ecosystem, sort of component. To your point, there still is a substantial amount of greenwashing going on, particularly because you have a lot of providers, whether they be banks or asset managers, who know they need to make the pivot, but for various business or other operational constraints, they don't have the infrastructure to really deliver on that. And so the easiest thing is to, put a label on a strategy and say they're doing X, Y, and Z, when in reality, they're not, I'd say, taking a more genuine impact forward approach to whatever strategy they're managing. The greenwashing is, I'd say, most commonplace in the public markets, which is where you're investing in stocks and bonds. That's liquid. It's harder to get away with that in the private markets because the companies that you're backing are usually so, pure, for lack of a better description, and what they're trying to attack. So it could be,
it's embedded in the foundation of their company. They don't have to segue to something different, create a whole new business model. It just is who they are.
Yeah. And it's often why they started the business in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah.
Often you have entrepreneurs who are, either coming out of school, have left school, maybe left McKinsey, maybe left, a cushy job, and are saying, all right, I want to tackle X. I want to tackle gender. I want to tackle, climate change. I want to tackle animal welfare, whatever it might be. And I'd say that's the biggest difference today that you didn't have anywhere near as much of 10 years ago, or arguably even 5 years ago, is like this, the sheer number of entrepreneurs who who are either starting companies or starting funds or leaving their jobs to join companies and funds like that. So there's just so much more to choose from. And so I think it's easier to invest in the private markets, to a degree, to avoid greenwashing, but harder to get access to the good stuff because it's harder to find. So that's where advisors like me play a role, is to help investors, families, and so on to find the good stuff that you can't find on a Morningstar or necessarily syndicate or somewhere where it's easier to do so when you're investing in the public markets.
When somebody comes to you, or just in general, if you're talking to individuals and they ask, like, they hear the word, right, and impact investing in their circles, or just in the general, nature of conversation in society, how do you explain it to them? Do you have the pitch down pat, or do you depend on who you're talking to as the length you'll take it to in like a description?
Yeah, I mean, my answer is usually it depends on how you define it, because it's a very
Yeah.
personal thing what impact means. Technically everything has an impact,
Yep.
both positive or negative. I tend to think of impact investing, and it's certainly defined as such, as an investment where the intention is to have an impact. And so that's, I think pretty, accepted nomenclature on how to define it. But then when you get into the weeds, for some people, the passion is, supporting, women in the marketplace. For others, it might be smallholder farmers. For others, it might be access to healthcare. And so part of the fun for me is I don't have to tell people what it means. I get to back and say, please tell me what it means to you. And if I can, I'll be there to help guide that defining process. Because, certainly for newer investors, they maybe know at the top level what they want to focus on, or maybe it's just a general feeling of, I just want to do good with what I've been lucky enough to either inherit or create, and I need help to figure out how to do that well. And so it's a very personal thing, but I certainly think that the biggest impact themes are climate, food, and equality. So that's where I encourage the people I work with to focus on as much as possible. And certainly, in my own personal investments and within our organization, where we lean in as much as possible, because we think the impact leverage, if you will, is highest in those themes. And then ideally, if you can, you try to find investments that, can touch all three. So maybe that means an investment that is focusing on food, that has substantial climate and environmental outcomes.
Right.
That is run by a diverse team.
All the themes kind of go back to climate in general, right? Like almost every single sector has some type of effect on the climate. Let's talk about food a little bit. That seems to be something that you're passionate about, and sort of the writings you've been doing, and sort of just your overall professional life lately. Like when did food come into your preview as a real way to tackle health, but also tackle climate issues as well?
The catalyst was my wife. We met in 2012, and she very quickly started to educate me on things like factory farming and animal welfare and all sorts of things that were completely, not on my radar.
Yeah.
And similarly, to what had happened with me professionally in my career of falling down the rabbit hole, I just really, fell hard for this theme. It became, just like my life passion. I got super excited about it once I really learned what was going on in the food system. It seemed to me, kind of crazy that I and many others are still and were really unaware of what goes on in our food system and the tax it has on the planet, on humans, and on the animals in the system. And so I got really excited, because it was like, well, people kind of talking about fossil fuels, and they're talking about housing and micro lending, but when I looked around, and this was back in 2012, I didn't see really much on food in a broad way. And so it also seemed like an opportunity for me, where if I could try to bring more attention to this theme, as an important impact investment, that could have even more leverage in my efforts, as opposed to focusing on something like energy or housing, where there was already a lot of effort sort of being done. And so that's why I chose it, and I've been running with it ever since.
Yeah, and just from that 2012 to now, so let's just call it a decade for easy math. There's been quite a bit of innovation, obviously, from lab grown and sort of plant-based and cellular agriculture. Now I'm learning a bit more about, which is to me one of the most fascinating things, regenerative agriculture, sort of understanding farming better, and looking at farmers as they should be like celebrities and known more, right? I mean, they are the people who like
Absolutely.
drive humanity every day. It's crazy kind of that they're so unknown and don't necessarily have a voice of their own. It's a bit odd. Family farm, like obviously commercial farming is a bit
Right.
different, but I mean like the people who just keep it in the family and just do every day, every year, every decade. It's pretty insane when you look at the supply chain and how everything works. But since that decade that you've kind of thrown a lot of your energy at it, what are the innovations you've seen that have been really been positive?
Well, you touched on all of them. I mean, certainly, within plant-based, the innovations that have manifested to just finally, in my opinion, create products that people want to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Plant-based has been around forever. Tofu, in the
Yeah.
Asian community, going back, it's hundreds of years. And even recently companies like Tofurky and others that were in the marketplace. But outside of the the vegan and vegetarian community, nobody was eating this stuff because for the most part it didn't resemble the products that they know and love.
Yeah.
And so it's been the innovation within plant-based to really more accurately mimic the mouthfeel and taste and experience of meat and chicken and fish and pork and so on has been substantial. The two complements to that have been, precision fermentation, where you've got companies that are basically taking, bacteria and other, sort of materials and expressing them in ways to create dairy proteins and egg white
Mm-hmm.
proteins and, gelatin without needing an animal. And, the potential for that to serve as ingredients for the food supply chain is really, I think, an underappreciated story, even though there are a few companies that have raised some substantial capital in last couple of years. And then you touched on a cellular ag. I mean, this is the real, I'd say the biggest question mark looming over the food system is, can this really, work? Can it scale? And how hard is it going to be to get both the regulatory ecosystem and consumers to get on board?
Yeah.
I'm optimistic about cellular ag. I think that consumers are actually going to be way more receptive to this than the current polling suggests when they do consumer data.
Yeah.
I think the biggest question mark is going to be regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be sort of a domino effect where you're going to have countries, which has already happened, like Japan and Singapore, creating regulatory approval for these products to enter the market. And then I expect more within Asia to, sort of manifest as a result of that, as more, production and capacity is possible to, make that regulatory approval, necessary. And then, likely, you'll see the US, and then probably last will be Europe. And then eventually it'll be, a reality. I'd say, that's the trinity of sorts for
Yeah.
the, alternative protein, space. And then, to a, lesser effect, but equally important, is what you're seeing in ag tech, which is, food waste technology. So you have companies like Appeal, as an
Mm-hmm.
example, that are creating really novel ways to try to reduce the amount of food waste and the carbon footprint of the supply chain. Because if you can, ship avocados on a boat instead of via plane, that's a game changer. If you can minimize 40 to 50% of that waste, massive amounts of water, energy, and other, sort of inputs that, don't end up in a landfill creating methane
Yep.
and so forth. So, to me, those are the things that I've been most excited by. And then I'd say the last theme is what's going on with, fungi or fungus just in general. So
Mm-hmm.
whether it's, mushroom-based meats,
Yep.
mushroom-based, which is less, food related, but mushroom-based like leather and plastic and packaging. And then to an extent, what's happening in psychedelics. I think there's just, mushroom as a theme, or the things that can
Yeah.
come out of fungus is becoming a bigger deal now, and will probably be even more of a big deal in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's like an entire ecosystem just in fungi. Like there's so many different applications that can be used for that. Literally that one organism can produce
Right.
so many different things in so many different verticals. It's really amazing. I wanted to touch back on just from the cell ag point of view, just so like to be clear, like I think the way I understand it is that you can essentially like utopian idea, kind of walk into a restaurant, let's say a steakhouse,
Right.
and you could like maybe it's on a family farm or something, and you can like eat outside and look at the cow or the bull or whatever the animal is that you're actually eating from, because they don't have to no longer have to kill the animal. You just take sort of the DNA or something from a living animal, and then they can sort of recreate sort of that same feel you would get if that animal was slaughtered. But you could also say thank you to that animal and go over and like hug them or something, right? Like it's really kind of crazy, but also like, I don't know. It seems like, I guess the negative side would sort of be what, I guess, from like you said, a regulatory standpoint, what are the hurdles faced there for that not to be okay to sort of do?
The hurdles are more just from a scale and practical standpoint. You're basically trying to create an industry from scratch that requires a fairly substantial amount of infrastructure, because you have to create these cell lines, right? So as you
Right.
say, you're harvesting cells, let's say from a particular cow or a particular chicken or a particular pig or fish, you name it.
Yeah.
And you want those cell lines to be strong. And like any other, human, some, have better cells than others. And
Yeah.
so, part of the work is finding the best cell lines that are best, structured for replication. Secondly, you have to create a scalable medium, which is basically the thing that mimics the role of blood, that allows the cells to multiply like they would on the body of an animal, or like in our system. And historically, that's been the trickiest part, is, because they had to use what was called fetal bovine syrup before, which is basically the blood of an animal, and it defeats the purpose. And it was, it's not consistent, it's expensive. And so the effort has been in this industry to create a suitable replacement for that, that you didn't require an animal for, both for, for price, but also for consistency. Because like anything else, if you look at McDonald's or any other, massive business, what they can do is they can create a repeatable product, a billion times in a row, and it just will not be any different.
You could scale it. Yeah.
Exactly. And so companies are now, whether it's Upside Foods or a number of others, are coming up with these plant-based serums that can, replace the previous technology in which these cells can grow within. And then as these cells replicate, then you need to put them in a bioreactor where you can create a process by which those cells converge on one another and actually turn into the fibrous muscle that you would normally expect to be produced if it was on the body of a cow or a chicken. And that's a crude example of how you can basically take a cell and grow meat. But there's a lot of moving parts to do it. And much like trying to create, the Model T, it's not easy. You're going from the horse to the car, and sure. It requires a lot of engineers, a lot of science, a lot of money, and a lot of time. And so the good news is that there's so much money flowing into this space now, and so many smart people focusing on it, and large corporates and food companies buying into wanting to, build the backbone of this industry because they see a future in it, that it's happening much faster. And you can leverage things like AI and machine learning and all sorts of other stuff to also give you a little extra speed in the process. And so you have companies that are making meat now. So it's not a question of whether we can do it. It's just a question of, can you do it at a price and at a consistency where you could actually compete with the meat that comes from factory farms, because that's really what they're going to be competing with, not the, the cows that are being grown on the farms in a regenerative way. I don't necessarily see that world going away. If anything, I could see that becoming more in demand, kind of going back to how we used to raise and treat animals, and really trying to focus on getting rid of this factory farming model, which is what's causing the majority of the problems in our food system from a climate standpoint, water, land, foodborne illness, and a host of other things, not to mention, the way in which we treat the animals in the system. So cellular ag is trying to aim at that, because there are certain things right now plant-based just can't achieve, to replicate. And so the question is, how can you leverage what cellular ag can do with what plant-based can do, and maybe
blend those together,
hybrid products. So an example would be what's happening now is you have companies that are making cellular fat, which is easier to achieve. So you can basically grow the fat that you would get off of a cow, which has certain properties and flavors and whatnot, and then mix that with the plant-based product that is lacking that. And then you can get kind of the benefits of the plant-based, which has health advantages, and inject some of the fat from the animal, which gives you better performance. And that, can get you closer to achieving the ideal product faster than trying to grow, a complete burger through the cellular, landscape, which is, just a little bit further off for the standpoint of being able to produce it globally.
And it's also interesting. I always try to look at it from a bunch of different lenses, both from the development world standpoint and also from like a developing world standpoint, where, people die of starvation, right? Every year. And how do you solve hunger at a place where you can't grow food, right? Or it's a lack of nutritious food. But and also sort of these, in areas of the world where killing endangered species, right, to eat is a thing, right? But what if you could take the cells of a shark and have shark without killing a shark, right? So then you can kind of serve all these different angles of like the most, impoverished people in the world. Like, how do we feed the world nutritiously? Not just feed the world with, crap, but,
Right.
actually nutritious food. But then also serve, a developed class that is pardon the pun, but like hunger for different types of food, right? Or different types of entertainment or taste, right? You can serve these both purposes without sort of obviously killing animals, but then also the effects on climate, perhaps solve hunger in a lot of different ways. Do you see anything? Do you see anybody working in the field of that? And maybe it's almost, I look at regulation where it's, if you look at how you can solve a systemic social issue, like first, perhaps that is like what regulation can move on and say, hey, we can use this to like go to the UN and have them pass something like, hey, let's feed the people who don't have no food. Like they're dying. So like a simple, like, can we make like an emergency use of something like this to feed people, right? Like something
Right.
like that.
No, I
There's
hear where you're
anybody
going
do.
with it. I mean, I think what you're touching on is critical because, as you mentioned, there are a lot of people who are food insecure around the world, and because of an ever increasing, volatile climate, it's only going to get harder to grow food.
Mm-hmm.
And so having technology that allows us to grow more of our food indoors is going to be critical
Mm,
for ensuring the stability and resiliency of the supply chain. And COVID just gave us a little bit of a glimpse of other factors that can influence a very sort of imperfect supply chain. So if you can create a more decentralized supply chain where you can grow produce and
mm-hmm.
meat and other things regionally, and
Right.
not have the avocados coming from South America
Right.
and the tuna coming from Japan and so on and so forth, you can do a lot more to eliminate the challenges within the supply chain currently, but also national security issues as well, because
Totally.
countries are going to probably start getting a little bit less generous with the food they're willing to share with other countries. If the planet continues to get more and more challenged, as it looks like it absolutely will at an increasing pace. And so vertical farming is a great example of that. They're trying to figure out how to grow more things indoors, or even just indoor farming, which where you are in the Netherlands, they have
Yeah.
pretty much perfected. They supply, I think, the second largest amount of food globally, and they do it on 1/27th of the land that the U.S. does. It's because they're growing
Yeah.
so
Small
much
country. Yeah.
indoors. And so, you look at countries like Singapore that import 90% plus of their food. This is why
Mm,
they're focusing on this technology, is because they understand that this is a national security issue, it's a resiliency issue, and it's a sustainability issue. And so I think all of that will then feed into supporting the emerging and frontier economies, because if you can scale this technology, it will become even cheaper for these countries to afford it,
right.
to install it, and be less beholden to the developed market, which has historically been terrible in the way that
Yep.
they've treated these people and these countries. And so that's kind of the beauty of the food system for me and for others, is there's so many ways in which if we can improve and fix the way we make food, all these challenges can be
Other
solved.
yeah, all these ancillary positive effects start to happen. And when I had spoke to another person about sort of the food systems and sort of basically had making this transition, and I was like, all this seems so great, and I was like, there's one, like, it's great for the capital allocators and the companies, because there's a lot of money to be made here, right? And for governments, I think there's a lot of positive social aspects to this that we just talked about. I'm like, why is it so hard? And he was just like, well, the supply chains are so ingrained in how they've done things for like 50 years. It's like the supply chains are so hard to change, right? That you can make the parallel to like governments, right? They're not built to change and adapt and move fast. And so he's like, you really have to create a brand new food supply chain system, like, built for this. And that's a long journey, and that's a hard road.
And so the key is, some of these things, like we talk about cellular ag, are going to take a lot more time because of the infrastructure. And then there are other things like within plant-based that are easier because you're relying on existing technologies for extrusion. You're relying on,
Mm-hmm.
bases like soy and pea and other things that we make in massive quantities. So there are ways we can bridge the gap to create a little bit more time for these other technologies that require, a lot more investment and a lot more, progress, to get to the point where they can scale. the biggest challenge has been getting governments to take this issue seriously. Everywhere, just about I've looked across the globe, they seem to still not really get, what needs to happen within food. Everybody seems to, whenever you hear about climate change, talk only about fossil fuels as if that's the only challenge.
Right.
Whereas food is equally, if not more, taxing on the planet on a whole host of issues. And so I think, the biggest failure thus far has been governments, talking about this, actually creating incentives like they did in energy for solar and wind to make it easier for these companies to compete, to try to reorganize the way subsidies are delivered, to disincentivize, this model that is, not built for the long term.
Right.
And so it's really tough. I'm a board member of and advise a number of different nonprofits who work very hard at this issue of trying to get policy to move the needle. But like any other industry, you have so many ensconced titans who don't want this change, that they are working diligently to prevent that from manifesting, at least until they can position themselves to benefit from it, really slowing things down. And so, the only good news is that the major consumer products and goods companies, whether it be Nestle, Unilever, and so on, are pivoting pretty hard towards plant-based, towards, organic, thinking more about regenerative, in addition to their, plastics and other, things. They're becoming less of a problem. I think they're still haven't pivoted enough to really, put the full force of their power behind this. But I think they see this as being the easiest way for them to meet their climate goals, and also the easiest way to create a more resilient supply chain. Because let's face it, raising animals is a tough business. You could ask any farmer, it is not easy. There's so many foodborne illnesses you got to deal with, the slaughtering process. Just the sell by dates. I mean, you name it. There's a lot that goes into it. It is way easier to slaughter a pea and to make it taste like meat. And so, anybody who's in the food business would much rather be dealing with these inputs, so long as they can make it, in a way that people are going to eat it and do it at a price that is as competitive, if not from a margin standpoint, because they'll achieve all their, for the most part, all their Paris and COP, related goals, by pivoting, away from traditional proteins. So they get it. It's just, trying to get them to get there faster. And that's where governments, unfortunately have not stepped up yet.
I like to end usually a little bit on the future. And I know we talked a lot about a bunch of different things that haven't sort of happened yet and we hope does happen. But if you look maybe, 3 to 5 years down the line, what do you hopeful happens? Maybe what are some of the successes and goals that maybe, you and the team and the firm have going forward?
Well, we talked about policy, so obviously we just love for there to be a lot more movement on that front. But insofar as the capital markets, I would, I expect there to be a lot more emphasis on health, sort of focus within these products, because, unfairly, but, nonetheless, a lot of plant-based products like the Beyonds and Impossibles are perceived to be unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's going to be a lot more, a lot more companies and demand for what we call, just like a healthier for you version. So whether it's, jackfruit or just other, cleaner plant-based options that are more whole food plant-based options, that's probably the best way to describe it. I think will become more common because I know, like, if you look at a Chipotle, they don't want to put Beyond and Impossible on there because they just don't want to use a processed meat. But if somebody can come along and give them a jackfruit product that, pulls like pulled pork does, which jackfruit does, I'm pretty sure that's going to end up on their menu well before Beyond or Impossible will. So I think that's something you can expect. And what I hope to see is just a lot more adoption on the part of, QSRs and other fast food chains to put more plant-based products on their menu and more consumers to demand it. And I expect that will only continue. So I don't think it's much of a prediction. I think the biggest thing is just how much money is going into this space right now and how much more money I think will go into it in the future, and how many more startups and funds are going to be focusing on this theme, so that, before you know it, this is going to be a much bigger deal than it is currently, even though it feels like a big deal now because it was basically a zero deal, 10 years ago. And a pipsqueak 5 years ago. And now it's like on the lips of like just about every venture investor on the planet is what's going on in alternative proteins and sustainable food. And I think it will be a more institutionalized, sort of investment ecosystem in 5 or 10 years, which means that for people who have their money at banks or at a Fidelity, it's going to be a lot easier to invest in the private markets. I think there's going to be a lot of progress made on removing some of the barriers for people to invest in these marketplaces like you have now with like the accreditor investor, requirements. So there's no requirement for you to, bet on the lotto or go gambling, but
Right.
for some reason you can't
Yeah.
invest, in a startup. And
So
so
crazy.
I think that will change. And the good news about that is it will democratize the ability for people to put, smaller dollar amounts into companies like this, which they just can't do right now. And that
Yep.
will drive even more, investment and interest in this space, and hopefully, change consumer behavior as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Michael. This was amazing. I think, food, like we don't think, like you said, about, we think about climate as obviously this huge issue at the top of the non-food chain, but the top of the chain in humanity. We talk about fossil fuels and we think of sort of cars, right? And sort of the movement of machines and things like this and what that uses. But like you said, I mean, food is probably pretty equivalent, if not above it in a lot of different aspects. So
Absolutely.
if we're speaking climate top of mind, it just seems like food would be one of the first things that should be mentioned and invested in, and policy made behind it. Because obviously it, like you said, there's so many ancillary benefits that come from progressing this industry and supply chain and just using technology to get the most out of it that we can. Right. And so I think that's a fascinating part about all this. So I appreciate